First of all, a correction or a clarification. Several people in the room heard me refer to mindfulness as something. I said this vile spread of mindfulness. I actually thought I said this viral. And so for the record, camera, viral. I don't think it's vile at all. I'm all in favour of it. I must be more careful with my syllables. Okay, we have an hour, nearly. I'd like to conclude with another period of silent illumination, silent reflection or whatever. But I'm very happy to take whatever comments, questions you have and try to respond to them to the best of my ability. Stephen, you had something, didn't you?
Thanks so much.
Oh, wait a minute, there's a roving mic. We need it to be recorded.
Oh, goodness, okay. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the clarity and how concise you're being in bringing all of this work that you've been doing over so long. I guess I had one, I've got loads of questions, but one that I thought I'm really curious about is how does this secular Buddhism that you're developing relate to those Protestant and modernist Buddhist movements that happen in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially in your European kind of Orientalist scholars and the Asian reformists around that time, who try to make Buddhism compatible with science, and also try to claim that they're going to an original Buddhism. And now, one difference I think in what you're saying is you've got a much more sophisticated historical understanding, it seems to me, of the contingency than some of those proponents. But how does your work differ to, say, Thomas William Rhys Davids and his take on Buddhism? Thanks.
Okay, I can't go into Rhys Davids. I don't know his work well enough to comment. But broadly speaking, I think that what I'm doing, and also many others, I mean, I'm not alone in this, is actually on a continuum with these, with the people of that period. And I think there have been there sort of, I seem to see sort of phases and waves. There was a period, particularly towards the end of the British colonial time in Burma and Sri Lanka and India, that actually triggered a reappraisal by Burmese and by Sri Lankans, particularly, what's his name, Anagarika Dhammapala, some of these, Lady Sayadaw, some of these people. And we fail actually to recognize that, let's say, this mindfulness movement has its origins actually in the Burmese counter-imperialist philosophy. We wouldn't have mindfulness now if it hadn't been for the British who colonized Burma. I'm not entirely joking, actually. Ditto Sri Lanka. I mean, both of these were Buddhist countries that were overwhelmed by British imperial power, and the people of those lands wanted to somehow stand up to this domination and destruction of their traditions as they saw it, but they realized that they wouldn't get very far if they just promoted Buddhism as gilding pagodas. So they went back to the sources of their own tradition, often with a Western education, a critical historical perspective on texts, on history, that led them to recover, in Burma, for example, the applicability of vipassana or mindfulness practice outside of the monastery. It's the first time that had happened, and then they devised these courses for ordinary working people to get in touch with what they thought to be the core of Buddhist practice. That was subsequently taught to people like Mr. Goenka, Denison, Coleman, and others, and then people like Jack Cornfield and who train with Mahasi and so on. They bring that back to the West and present it as Buddhism, probably not really aware of the historical background. And we find, wow, that's That makes a lot of sense. That seems very sort of clear and direct and practical and functional. And on the basis of that, then Kabat-Zinn does his Vipassana retreat and takes it one step further. So I think it's very important to see that a lot of what we're doing in struggling to figure out what the Dharma is and how it speaks to our time have precedents that go right back into the end of the 19th century. And there are phases through that period where these different threads get further developed. So I see my work very much within that framework. I do think it's important to use historical critical methodologies to get a clearer picture, not only of what were probably the earliest original ideas of the Buddha's teaching, but also a clearer idea of the Buddha as a human being, a clearer idea of the context within which he worked in his historical period. That helps us enormously in distinguishing between elements that are essentially cultural or Indian or Chinese or Japanese from something that is, in a sense, universal, that addresses the human condition irrespective of your nationality and so on. When I wrote a book years ago called The Awakening of the West, which is a study of how Europe in particular came into contact with Buddhist ideas through the course of history. And one of the things that struck me was that from about 1800, which is when the first Asian, non-European religious texts were translated into Latin or into English, every 40 years or so there was another kind of resurgence of interest. So you have 1800, the Bhagavad Gita, Royal Asiatic Society is formed. Then 1840 roughly, you have the first scholarly works on Buddhism appearing in French. 1880, you have the Theosophical Society with Blavatsky, Olcott, which identifies with Buddhism. Olcott and Blavatsky become Buddhists. Then you get the first Westerners who become monks about 1900. Actually, it's not been pushed back now to about 1880. 1920 was in the next 40-year cycle. Again, not such a big movement in terms of Buddhism, but still the beginnings of Buddhist societies throughout Europe was happening then. 1960, need I say any more? Well, the Dalai Lama coming out of Tibet in 1959, the whole 60s, journey to the East. And then it struck me, well, okay, then the next phase should be 2000. I was writing this book in the early 90s. And I couldn't for the life of me imagine what the next phase would be then. Now I know. It's the vile spread of mindfulness. Viral spread of mindfulness. And that fits the picture, so it's quite weirdly appropriate. But the interesting thing is, when I was writing that book, and that was in the 90s, I would never have foreseen that. Hadn't got a clue. That came upon us out of the blue, this mindfulness thing. So again, it kind of confirms the fact that what we're part of in a bigger time frame is a process of acculturation of non-European ideas and values, my own specific interest being, of course, Buddhism, and how that is weaving its way into our culture in all manner of unexpected forms and guises. Yes, Julia.
I was really, is that okay? Yeah. Yes. I was really interested when you talked about the Sambudaya. And
Sorry, the what?
So this is in the Four Truths.
Oh, the Samudaya, yeah.
The Samudaya.
Samudaya, yeah.
And that it doesn't really seem to mean origin at all. It really was very surprising and shocking. Well, sort of shocking in a way, not in an unpleasant way, but just like, wow. And I don't know if I'm going to be very clear, so I appreciate your clarity here. But what I wondered is the relationship between arising and codependent arising, dependent origination, because that seems to me a very important map, and kind of the relationship between that and the Four Noble Truths, in a way. It's like there seems to be a depth there in codependent arising. And I'm wondering if in a way suffering and craving, or the arising that follows with suffering, it's a sort of codependent arising. I'm not sure, but
well,
appreciate.
I have a certain difficulty with the translation of sang upada as codependent arising. The co, I don't quite understand why people insist on this co business. The word in Pali or in the other Asian languages doesn't necessarily mean that. Sang is a very common prefix that functions really as a kind of intensifier. So you have sang udaya, for example, which you could I don't translate it as co-arising. Sang as a prefix means something like complete or full. Like, for example, you have Sambuddha. You don't talk of co-Buddha. You talk of completely awake. So you can, at times, find sang used in the sense of co. In other words, implying two things. But I wouldn't say that's the normative way to read it, and it's certainly not glossed that way in traditional Buddhist doctrinal theory at all. It's a Western way of reading that term. I think it's somewhat influenced by sort of ideas that we get in Avatamsaka, that everything arises together and all things are mutually interpenetrating and so on. But that's not implied in the early texts whatsoever. And in the Tibetan translation, Denjing Drelwa Jungwa is the way the Tibetans translate Paticca Samuppada. Again, you don't get the idea of co. They didn't render it that way at all. So that's not my preferred translation. I would translate it simply as conditioned arising. Paticca Samuppada. Upada, but arising there is the different word to udaya. You have udaya, upada, and there's other words too. So it's not actually the same word in Pali, but that doesn't matter enormously. I think the key point is that the way the Buddha saw and understood and engaged with the world was based on a thoroughgoing processual or empirical basis that was particularly alert to the ways in which conditions in one setting will have consequences in another, and how all change and development and evolution, whether for good or for bad, is initiated and sustained through sequences of events that have knock-on effects one with the other. But I think he understood this largely, not exclusively, but largely in a temporal sense, over time. Co-arising sort of suggests something a little bit more mystical, that things are sort of happening together. And that, of course, is sometimes the case. But there's very little in the early suttas that suggests that the Buddha saw this in that way, but saw it really as a framework for how do I, in a sense, construct and create my own who I am and what the world is in the context of the months and the years that follow, and presumably what will happen after my death as well. It's temporal in that way. And so I think it's rather important to emphasize that. I think these models here are all conditioned arisings where A is the condition for B, B is the condition for C, C is the condition of D, and that's happening in time. I think what the Buddha is basically trying to do is present us an ethical way of living that has consequences that we can actually see. It's not after our death, but it's actually in the course of being more alert to the things we say and think and do and what the knock-on effects of those are, whether we're causing more suffering or whether we're creating conditions that make us more angry. But it's constantly, in a way, attending to these tissues of connectivity between our thoughts, our words, our deeds, our acts, both on a microcosmic as well as on a social and on a much more global scale. Does that answer your question? Sort of. Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes?
Why do you use secular, the word, to specify your feelings about Buddhism. I mean, your description of Buddhism seems to basically be encompassing all of life. So what's secular got to do with it?
Good question. Well, I use the word secular in a, quite deliberately and consciously in a number of ways. I'm flagging secular in the conventional use of the term to contrast it with religious. That's definitely in our culture. If you listen to a Radio 4 discussion program, then the presenter might say, and now I'd like to invite a secular perspective from this scientist as opposed to this rabbi or whatever. So we all know what that means. And I want to flag the fact that the Dharma is not the exclusive preserve of what we call organized religion at all. And I think this, again, is a feature that's coming through this mindfulness business, is that the religious element seems to be kind of, it's not necessary. You can practice these things without self-identifying with any particular religion.
Well, what do you think the religious element is?
I'm
to
coming
be
to
more
that.
specific.
I will come to that. I will come to that. So that's one sense of secular. It's a flag to say we don't have to think of this as religious. The second usage is to take the word quite literally in its etymology. It comes from the Latin word seculum, which means this age, this world, this time. So I'm emphasizing a Dharma that addresses the conditions of our world here and now, as opposed to a Dharma that is concerned with our fate after death or in future lives or in different realms. So that's to flag that. Now maybe people who hear the word secular may not immediately get or associate it with that, but that I do explain in my books is a very important element of what it means to be secular. So a secular Dharma is a Dharma for this world and only this world. We leave aside any concerns about other realms of existence, rebirth, all that kind of stuff. The third point is actually something I picked up from the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama published a book a few years ago called Beyond Religion, which is a strange title for the man who's considered to be the head of a world religion. I can't imagine the Pope publishing a book called Beyond Catholicism, or even Beyond Religion. But what the Dalai Lama does is that he also picks up on this word secular. And he understands, the whole thrust of his argument in this book is to argue for a secular ethic that is global and not tied to the beliefs of any particular religion. And so for him, a secular ethic or a secular space is a space of tolerance. And he was inspired in this by his knowledge of the Indian constitution, which is a secular constitution that enables Muslims and Hindus and Jains and Buddhists and Christians and atheists to live in equality and mutual respect within a single space. I guess we don't have a written constitution in Britain, but basically our sense of this society is one that is tolerant of people of all different faiths and so on. And so I'd like to think of secular in those terms too. Secular to me is a space of tolerance, accepting of difference, not rejecting religions, but recognizing that those who hold religious beliefs are equally worthy of acceptance and respect, but without having to endorse any of their particular beliefs yourself. Religion. There's two ways in which I use the word religion. One is the conventional sense that when you walk into a church or go to Bangkok and walk into a temple, you would be very hard-pressed to say, this is not religion. We know it is. Incense, priests, sacred texts, doctrines. That's religion, but that I think is a fairly superficial version of religion. That's the superstructure. I'd rather recover the word religion in its deeper sense, which I would take to mean something like living your life according to your ultimate concerns, taking your life with deep seriousness, being ultimately concerned as to what it means to have been born and to have to die. That to me is the religious impulse, the religious feeling. And that I feel is of the essence. The actual doctrines and superstructures are, as it were, just decoration almost. And so I'd like to not reject religion, because I don't like some of the trappings of it, but to seek to recover the roots of the religious impulse for which all the world's religions are attempting to somehow respond, or are expressions thereof. So I think you can have a secular dharma that is deeply religious. In fact, you might even have I don't even have a difficulty with talking of a secular religion, actually. So when you pick these words apart, you actually find that they can be followed in ways that take us beyond just the sort of the immediate association we might have with them, and can maybe help us clarify and discuss, the space of the Dharma in the Buddhist language, and what does it mean to inhabit that space? Yeah. Could you wait for the mic? There we go.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thanks. I really appreciated your talk earlier, and the secular path, making it really quite clear in my head, because that's the path I follow really, but it does get a little bit mixed up with the wording. My question is, I suppose I listened to a YouTube video on the giving economy, and there was a Navajo woman who spoke about, and she spoke about the hoop of life as my
Sorry, the what?
Hoop. She
Hoop.
called it a hoop of life. Hoop. Every I think she meant species has their place in the hoop, and if a species gets out of hand, then it messes up the hoop. And I was thinking of the activities around the Dakota pipeline and the activism there, and that sense you get of the deep spiritual place where the Indians are coming from. And to me, the practice, from my superficial sense of what's going on, my practice of Buddhism and their practice doesn't seem different. So I wondered whether you knew much about it, or whether you could.
I think at some level, these are clearly quite different traditions. I think we shouldn't. I think it wouldn't be helpful to just sort of coalesce them all into one big sort of mixing pot. But on the other hand, I think they're both traditions that are seeking to address the primary questions of what it means to be human, and the primary questions of how we relate to and live in this environment. They may have different ways of expressing that, different ways of articulating it. But again, I think a secular Buddhist space would be one that would be very open to learning what these other traditions can bring us. I've recently taken quite an interest in shamanism, actually, Native American, maybe South American shamanism. And that too, I think, I've learned a great deal from that, but I wouldn't say it's the same as Buddhism. I think it complements and supports my Buddhist practice. I also think that we may find that at the roots of early Buddhism, they may have shamanic origins. I don't think the Buddhists, one of the things we've learned from our historical studies of that period in India where the Buddha lived, is that it's very questionable that the Buddha was brought up as a kind of Brahmanic Indian in the caste system and all this stuff. The part of India, the northeast, where the Buddha lived and taught, was not an area that had been Brahmanized at his time. That was more in the west of India. Whereas Buddhism always pitches itself as a kind of rejection of Hindu values and Brahmin priests and caste systems and so on. Whereas actually, I think there's probably more, the roots of the Buddha's own life as a younger man would have been within what we would now call an animist or shamanic world, which would probably have more resonances with the kind of spirituality we find within the Native Americans in North America and the shamans and others in South America. And I feel that we can probably learn an enormous amount by going into these traditions.
Yeah, I suppose my parallels just come from activism, I suppose, that it naturally follows that you protect and you give of yourself, and in order to protect for others and for yourself, really, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that I think one would like to think that anyone who lives a life in which they feel an empathetic sense of belonging to a much greater environment, whether we think of this in theistic or non-theistic terms, in animist or in Buddhist terms, it seems that inevitably that sense of belonging, that sense of identity with nature, would lead to a strong urge to protect what is under threat from these destructive forces. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Yes, gentleman over here with another mic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for your books and the research that you've done. I wondered if I could just explore your words about secularism a little bit further. In that, I think temperamentally, I feel I'm a secularist, and I think that the drive to reduce or at least make conscious the metaphysical statements of truth, with a capital T, and there have been, Western critiques of, what was lost by Platonism in elevating, denigrating everyday life and existence, and elevating truth with a capital T to a higher realm. But doesn't that, in a way, raise the whole question of whether Buddhism, whether the Dharma, whether the Buddha's insights are or were necessary? So are they necessary for us as humans to learn, to use these teachings as, wise counsel, but necessary in the philosophical sense of, having a meaning beyond our everyday? Is it, is it optional, or is it necessary, the Dharma?
Is it necessary? I don't quite understand the question. Necessary exactly in what sense? I don't quite get that. Could it not have happened and it would have made no difference? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, maybe something like that. But in a sense, if we are part of, if we want to put ourselves into a bigger narrative of truth and human life and the whole of the biosphere, are we necessarily obliged or necessarily gripped by the Dharma in that relationship? Or
okay.
I'm not being very clear.
That's okay.
But is it necessary?
Well, clearly there are people, probably a vast majority of people in our world today, who are engaged with the biosphere and these bigger questions, who have no need whatsoever for the Dharma. In that sense, it's not necessary, clearly, because there are other ways, like your Native Americans or whatever, who've got their own ways of dealing with these things. Let's make this a little bit more personal. In my own case, and this might resonate with you as well, I found as a young person I was very much concerned with these bigger issues of how to live and dance and so on and so forth, live a full, flourishing life, and a life of concern for the world, as it were, in possibly a very idealistic way. But I didn't find in my own Christian traditions here anything that really spoke to that. And that's what sent me and others off onto a quest to find, some way which would, in a sense, be more effective in meeting those needs. And that's what led me to Buddhism and to the Dharma. But of course, that too has undergone a lot of ramifications and changes in my own thinking. But I have remained, I think, in some ways I'm a bit of a fundamentalist, really, because I'm trying to go back to the foundations, you see. I'm trying to sort of identify what really distinguishes the Buddhist teaching from, let's say, what we find in Hinduism or Christianity or whatever. What is it that is unique and original? And in asking and pursuing that question, I find that this helps me refine the value of this particular approach, this approach of the Dharma, that I don't find elsewhere, really. And so that sense, to me, it is necessary. Until recently, let's say, I would have thought it was necessary. Some of my other research, which I haven't written about so much, is into the role of what are called the Hellenistic philosophies, Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism particularly. Pyrrho. I'm a great fan of Pyrrho. Pyrrho is the founder of skepticism. Pyrrho was also, he only lived a generation after the Buddha, and we know from Greek sources that he studied in India. He was part of Alexander's invasion. And I found enormous resonances and parallels in, let's say, Epictetus or Marcus Aurelius or Seneca or Pyrrho or Epicurus or Lucretius that seem to have far greater parallels with the Dharma than they do with, say, Christianity or Judaism or our traditional Western religions. And I wonder if in some ways that the early Dharma, particularly before it became an Indian religion, is actually something within the same, it has enormous family resemblances to these Hellenistic philosophies, which were also practices, philosophy as practice, the teacher as a physician, very similar to what we find in early Buddhism. And so I wonder in many respects whether we might be able to recover some of these lost philosophies and thereby bring early Buddhism into a closer alignment with what lies at the roots of our own Western tradition as well. And what might emerge out of that, I don't know. Relatively few people are interested in this. Although I was staying last night with a friend of mine near here, Antonia Maccaro, who's just finished writing a book on Buddhism and Stoicism, which will come out next year. So that, in that regard, I do think we have a lot of the Dharma already within some of these schools of thought. But what we don't find in Hellenistic philosophy are clearly defined practices at all. There's no sense whatsoever of the kinds of disciplines we'd find, say, in a meditation tradition. And so I think the Dharma is not just the philosophy or even just the ethics, but what's crucial about it is the fact that it is sustained a commitment to a core practice. That's the key. If you don't have the practice, the other elements are just theory, really. And the practice is necessary. That's the bit that's really necessary. Without actually applying these values and seeking somehow to thereby change your life, then they have little appeal. Epicurus said the same. He said if you don't actually put this philosophy into practice, if it doesn't actually heal your soul, he says, it's worthless. So provided we understand that in Dharma, then yes, Dharma practice, I would say, is necessary. Whether we call it Dharma or something else, I don't really mind. But that is necessary. It's the practice element that's necessary. Yes? And then at the back.
Thank you. My question kind of follows on from that, which is I'm really enjoying all of this, both your talking and the discussion, but it reminds me very much of when I studied the philosophy of religion at university and ended up just getting completely tied up in linguistic knots. So then I went to do theology to see if that was any better, and it was so completely unquestioning that it was equally frustrating. So My question is, how do you balance your work using linguistic and mental constructs with the non-verbal knowing of your practice?
That's a very good question. And the honest answer is that it's an ongoing struggle. But I don't see the two as somehow operating in disparate or different spheres. One of the things that's always, in a sense, troubled me about the Western academy is that is this idea of objectivity, that you, the scholar, are supposed to keep a nice distance from your subject matter and not infect it with your own prejudices or biases or longings or beliefs, and to see it clearly and objectively as it really is. And that's one of the reasons I've never done a university degree in anything, because I just don't like that environment. I don't want to separate myself in that way. I don't want that existential distance. To me, the engagement with these texts, and I'm mainly talking of early Pali and also some Chan texts in Chinese, is that I want to enter into a living dialogue with these texts. I want to gain a sense that these texts are actually addressing my condition, and they're speaking to me, they're actually challenging me in some way, that they're challenging me to change the way I think and live. And if I try to put those injunctions into practice, when I return to the texts, they've changed. To me, the beauty of this very simple thing, these Four Noble Truths, for example, is that you can keep going back to them. And you can keep recovering deeper layers of insight because they are an integral part of your practice. If you didn't seek to transform yourself in terms of what these texts are saying, then they would probably remain more or less static. They would just be objects of philological interest. But I'm not willing to relate to them in that way. My approach is unashamedly subjective. I'm interested in how these texts can address and change a human life. And so I find that my practice, let's say when I'm on a meditation retreat, when I'm trying to cultivate, say, concentration or mindfulness and so on, that is an integral part of an ongoing dialogue or conversation with a tradition that is mediated to me through texts. I'm obviously an intellectual kind of guy. I don't want to pretend otherwise. And I'm very, I feel often quite disappointed when Buddhist groups kind of have a default anti-intellectual stance. People say, oh, I'm not interested in the theory, I just want to do the practice. One of the things that brought that home to me many years ago was when I was studying in Switzerland in a monastery, a Tibetan monastery, and we were being taught by an old Mongolian Lama. And we were studying something which was incredibly dry, Buddhist logic. I can tell you that's pretty dreary stuff. Syllogisms, how a syllogism functions. And at the end of the course, one of the students said, Geshe-la, why do we have to do all this theory? Why can't we do more practice? And his answer was, if you really knew how to study, you would be practicing. And that's remained with me as a real beacon of insight. To me, study is practice. Practice is not reducible to something purely non-verbal or non-intellectual. If you think of how Buddhism, or the word practice, bhavana, I think it's probably the closest word in Pali, the whole of the Eightfold Path is to be bhavanad, or as we say here, cultivated, brought into being, realized. And so it's not a question of narrowing practice to one thing and then setting other parts of your life in opposition to it. It's a question of how can we extend the concept of practice to infuse and embrace all aspects of our life so that our whole life becomes a practice. We become practicing humans. Being human becomes our practice. So that's, broadly speaking, how I would address that question. The very back of the room.
Thank you very much. I was really interested in your discussion of the 4 tasks and really inspired, so thank you for that. I just wanted to ask you something, maybe I should say apologies in advance. I think it might come from a more psychological, even Western perspective. But I was thinking, so I very much like this emphasis on practice, but then I think, well, someone might look at these 4 tasks and say, well, the practice looks still very contemplative and very, maybe even the whole picture looks a bit, say, fatalistic, to put in a most provocative way. Fatalistic. So I'm thinking of reactivity, what you were talking about, patterns of reactivity. So suppose that I notice that I'm anxious and I have a highly anxious reaction in certain circumstances. So what do? Or I fully know it, I embrace it. I also manage to let it be. But I wonder, what would you say to someone who would say, well, I also want to do something about it, like engaging in, so maybe I do things like, I don't know, I make my room up in such a way that, I use colors that moderate my anxiety, or I use materials, I use the materiality of my life to change my patterns of reactivity. So what do you say about that? How would that fit into this picture, or would you say not really?
No, it fits absolutely perfectly into the picture. And it's considered, it's the 4th task. The 4th task is to, you see, if we put it in, okay, an example, I agree that I haven't illustrated these 4 tasks. Let me try and give you a concrete example, and as you're a psychologist, I'll give you a psychology type example. I'm not a psychologist, but I do teach retreats, and I spend a fair amount of those retreats interviewing students. Basically, it's counseling. Now, how do I apply the 4 tasks when I'm sitting in my teacher's room? There's a knock on the door, and one of the students comes in. I try to embrace that person unconditionally. I try to say yes to the person who's walking in that room. That's first task. Second task is I let go of my reactions to that person. What a reaction might be, oh great, her again. Or, oh no, him again. Or whatever it might be, oh no, she reminds me of my mother, or whatever it is. To notice how I react. To embrace that, but also to let it go. In other words, to notice that it's just what the organism and the conditioning is generating at that moment. I don't have to identify with it, believe it, buy into it, but I don't want to repress it and reject it either. I just notice it for what it is. I don't let it get in the way. At the same time, I try to settle into a non-reactive awareness, a non-reactive space that's not determined by that reactivity and that is open to the person and their concerns or their pain or whatever it is that they're bringing to this interview. In that space of mind, I then seek to respond to that person's needs. That person then might talk about a difficulty they're having in meditation, but to be honest, they usually talk about problems they have in their lives. And I try to be open to that. I try to respond to it as wisely, as caringly, as best I can in that situation. I try to suggest what that person might do if there's anything that I can offer in that regard. In other words, I engage with the situation. So the embracing, the letting go, the stopping is all a preamble to acting. If you look down at Elsa, embrace, let go, see the ceasing, and then actualize the way. Now, actualizing the way is shorthand for seeing things, thinking about them, speaking, acting, working, livelihood. It's all there. It's the Eightfold Path, as the Buddhists call it, is shorthand for how do I engage with the world in a non-reactive way. So yes, it could be anything. One of my favorite koans in Chan is by Yunmen, 9th, 10th century Chinese teacher, who was asked, what is the highest teaching of the Buddhas and the patriarchs? And his answer was an appropriate statement. In other words, there's no such thing as the highest teaching, because that's abstraction. What matters most is whether you respond appropriately to the situation at hand or not. It's the responsiveness rather than the reactivity that is to be cultivated, and that could go off in virtually any direction whatsoever. There's no right or wrong way to do it. There's no right or wrong answer to the suffering of the person who comes for the interview on the retreat. It's how do I respond in the most appropriate way? And it might be, say, I'll suggest you should take up painting or poetry or something. I do that, actually. I often encourage people to get involved in the arts. I think meditation often arts are sometimes, especially outside of Zen, art and is considered to be a bit worldly. But no, I think all of these things need to be integrated into our practice in a really real way. So yeah, I think it's all there, actually.
I struggle with an understanding of reincarnation, and I feel as though I'm meant somehow to get this. I'm meant to accept or to know this. This is part of the explanation, part of the kind of the Dharma teachings.
Mm-hmm.
So is secular Buddhism for me? I mean, where does it fit?
Well, if you're having troubles with reincarnation, then it probably is. I've struggled with reincarnation for an awful long time, and I've become quite well-known / notorious for rejecting it. Initially, I had an agnostic. I opted for an agnostic position, and I was simply, well, I don't know, which is the honest answer. Nobody actually knows whether there's reincarnation or not. You ask any of some reincarnate Tibetan Lama if they actually remember their past lives, and they say, oh no, but when I was a little boy, my mother used to say, that kind of thing. There's no evidence for it. There's some anecdotal evidence based on reports of young children, and usually in places like Sri Lanka and elsewhere, that recall details of past lives, and the people have studied that. But frankly, it's, to me, now a total irrelevance. A total irrelevance. It's a feature of ancient Indian, not even ancient India. At the time of the Buddha, the notion of reincarnation extended across the civilized world. Plato believed in reincarnation. Pythagoras believed in reincarnation. I think it was quite at that time it might have been a rather obvious thing. And if you imagine that these people are coming out of what is effectively an agrarian society, a society tied to agriculture, to the land, and then they have the leisure, when they become sufficiently prosperous, to be able to just, some people at least, to have the leisure to ask deeper questions about what life is for. Life, as they would have witnessed it and experienced it, would have been a life governed by the cycle of the seasons. That in the spring, the shoots arise, then they flourish, they bear fruit, and then they die. But the next spring, they rise up again. And if you really inhabited that kind of world in which your life depended, it would be quite obvious, almost unquestionable, that, well, that seems to be when Granny died, something left her body. And then maybe a generation, or let's say a year or two later, a little baby is born, she grows up. Hey, she looks just like Granny. Granny's come back. I think this way of thinking would have been natural, probably rather self-evident. But I think we live in a world now where that's just no longer the case. Well, it depends who you ask. If you ask me, no. If you ask a lot of Buddhists, they'd say yes. There are many Buddhist teachers, including modern Western ones, would say you cannot practice the Dharma if you don't believe in reincarnation. There's no point. You may as well just kill yourself, basically. Because if you want to end suffering, and you're not going to get reborn, well, it's a very simple solution. You blow your brains out. I'm not joking. And in fact, the Buddha did not have a thing. He actually accepted, it seems from the suttas, that monks of a certain level of attainment he thought it was perfectly okay if they just cut their throats. They took the knife, is the word. This is not widely broadcast in Buddhist circles, but it's there in the suttas. So I think we live in such a different world to that of ancient India that we can't just perpetuate beliefs like that uncritically because it's been passed down since time immemorial by some revered tradition. And there's I could go on and on, but I'm not going to. I think there's a lot of evidence in the early suttas that the Buddha likewise didn't really think of this as a terribly important point, actually. He's quite agnostic about it in some texts. In others, he says the idea that consciousness could get reborn, he says that's impossible. So he uses the language of rebirth, but he doesn't offer any way to understand it or to explain it. And much of his teaching, which is basically recognizing the fundamental contingency of consciousness upon the material world, simply doesn't fit with reincarnation. And all the later Buddhist traditions had to come up with some special bit of consciousness that gets reborn. None of those are mentioned in the early text at all. So Buddhism itself has struggled with this. I think it's similar to what I was saying about how the Four Truths emerged, is that the Buddhist community had to come up with a way of understanding reincarnation in order to be a credible and legitimate Indian religion. That is my view. It's 5:25. Let's have a quiet 5 minutes before we eat. Thank you. I guess we all will share food here, is that right, in this space? Do we have another space?
It's all in here.
All in here, okay.
It's all there.
Enjoy your lunch. Do you need to make any announcements?